They wiped my name from the organizational chart, yet they overlooked the fact that I engineered the critical backbone of the company. It was precisely 4:20 p.m. when the alert popped up. Can you step into the executive conference room? I assumed it was a standard update, a quick huddle regarding the new platform rollout, or a final check on the framework migration. Business as usual. I walked toward the back, half expecting to see my product manager or someone from the engineering lead team. Instead, the human resources representative was already there, posture rigid, lips pressed into a thin, unsmiling line. That instant, the cold wave hit me. I hesitated in the doorway and spotted the other figure, Robert Vance, the chief executive officer. His crisp, expensive suit and perfectly coiffed hair were the same as they were years ago when we shared a dingy office and wrote code fueled by bad coffee. Now, he looked at me with the blank, detached air of someone viewing an obstacle. He didn't offer a greeting. The HR rep launched into the obligatory corporate monologue. We're undergoing a phase of restructuring, a strategic streamlining initiative. This is not a reflection of your contribution. The word streamlining was all I truly registered. A decade of my life was evaporating. I waited for Robert to break the silence, to offer some semblance of respect. But he simply slid a plain manila envelope across the table. It was a transaction of dismissal, a stack of documents for a temporary worker who had lingered too long. I looked down. Severance offer, exit protocols, non-disclosure agreements, all meticulously printed, tabbed, and ready. Clinical efficiency. I met Robert's gaze. Nothing, not even a glimmer of recognition for the 11 years we'd spent building this company. My throat tightened, but I refused to let them witness any weakness. I signed the page as they indicated, collected my access card, and walked out. A cardboard container was already waiting at my desk, neutral brown, secured by a single strip of clear packaging tape. The silent, impersonal ritual for the newly exiled. I passed the hardware I helped specify, the architectural blueprints I had color-coded and pinned to the roadmap wall, and the junior developers who still relied on proprietary logging tools I built from the ground up. Not one person made eye contact. Reaching the elevator bank, I paused to regulate my breathing. My grip on the box was shaky, far tighter than necessary. 11 years nullified. They believed they could simply delete my presence. But this is the fundamental oversight of dismissing a foundational engineer. The structure retains the memory of its architect, and I hadn't forgotten the cornerstone I had embedded in that foundation. Sitting in my vehicle, I felt no anger. The lack of fury was surprising. I expected a tidal wave of resentment. Instead, I just stared out the windshield. The engine idled quietly beneath me. The box sitting on the passenger seat, an unsolicited monument to my time there. A decade distilled into a handful of office artifacts and a stained coffee mug. I didn't leave the garage. I sat there on the third level of the apex structure, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. The western sky was beginning to glow with sunset colors, and my mind drifted back to the very first server rack I secured for them. Back then, the company wasn't even called Apex. It was just me, Robert, and 2 other developers surviving on instant noodles and pure ambition in a cramped Fort Worth office. We operated out of a makeshift co-working space. Folding chairs, scavenged monitors, wires held up by masking tape, and a lease rack at a local data center that tolerated our late payments as long as we kept the power draw low. One evening, I single-handedly rebuilt their entire licensing framework. I worked through the night when the initial code base failed under heavy user load. It wasn't my assignment or my job description, but I saw the system failing. I brewed another pot of convenience store coffee and wrote until dawn. That overhaul, that single, sustained effort, is why their compliance framework achieved enterprise scale. It's why they were able to secure the major corporate clients in those crucial initial years. That one night's labor provided the initial, crucial building blocks for the empire that had just ejected me. Robert used to call me the stabilizer, the one who could always make the complex systems interconnect. I remember the night we filed the patent application. We were sharing greasy tacos. I handed him the legal packet and said, "This protects us." He laughed, never bothering to read past the summary. Because buried deep within the fine print, on page 43, clause 11 was my failsafe, not a dramatic legal firework. Just one simple sentence that secured my original leverage. Activation of the Unified Compliance API license requires consensus approval from all original architectural contributors. Singular contributor means singular consent. That was my technical signature. They filed it, they signed it, and they never properly reviewed it. They assumed I had forgotten the clause, perhaps viewing it as obsolete code that gets commented out and ignored. I hadn't forgotten. I simply allowed it to remain dormant at the base level of the system stack, too deep for any junior engineer to stumble upon. And now, sitting there, watching my former colleagues walk to their cars as if nothing had happened, the truth crystallized. They had constructed their $2.6 billion edifice on top of a cornerstone that was still legally tethered to my name. Robert and I were partners. Not just colleagues, but co-creators who built the system line by line, late into the night, back when the server room was just a cabinet of rented machines, and the break room doubled as a strategy board. We crashed in our chairs sometimes. We'd fight passionately over database schema and be laughing about it over reheated food 2 hours later. He'd send me late-night commit messages like, "This feature will definitely crash production. Want to see how fast?" And I'd reply, "Push it. I've already written a rollback script." Then he was gone. He enrolled in an executive development program, an expensive high-level course in Silicon Valley, complete with glossy brochures and vision statements. I recall the night before he left. He didn't say goodbye. He just left a yellow sticky note. "You'll manage. You always operate within safe limits, anyway. You always operate within safe limits." That line stuck with me. The man who used to rely on me to fix his broken code at 2 a.m. suddenly decided I wasn't significant enough for the executive table. He was away for 2 years. When he returned, it wasn't Robert. It was Robert Vance, CEO of Apex Solutions. Same name, entirely new operating system. The camaraderie was replaced by distance, the late-night calls by formal briefings. He now had an executive assistant named Sarah and board meetings that utilized phrases like synergize user-centric metrics without a hint of irony. He stopped acknowledging me in meetings. Never once nodded. I convinced myself it didn't matter. The work itself was my statement. That was until I found the investment deck. I wasn't supposed to see it. A forward error, perhaps, or forgotten access rights. There was 59 slides designed to secure a new funding round, filled with high-gloss graphics and buzzwords. And in the very center, my original licensing architecture blueprint, copied verbatim from a technical white paper I had authored 3 years earlier and only shared with Robert. No citation. No credit. He didn't just sideline me. He stole my creation, repackaged it with a better font, and called it his own. The real punchline. That deck was the one that earned him the CEO title, as an associate mentioned offhand at Company Mixer. I had seen it. I had written the most vital half of it. 6 months before the firing, I received an email from Robert. Subject, standard IP review, needs quick sign-off. No body text, just an attachment and a generic thanks. He probably didn't even type it. At first, it looked like standard legal boilerplate. I nearly signed it without reading. I would have had a faint, unsettling instinct not caution me. There were rumors of a major corporate realignment, and Robert's overly casual tone triggered the gut feeling you develop after years of fixing complex, failing systems. So I printed it. I sat down with a marker and a red pen and dissected every paragraph. Page 7. That's where they tried to revoke my leverage. Clause 11.2b. All architectural rights, compliance mechanisms, and associated logic are exclusively licensed to Apex Solutions unless specifically superseded by a new agreement. That was new, clean language, perfectly inserted among generic vendor terms. But I recognized its intent. They would try to override my original clause that required my sign-off for any license grant. They wanted my control gone. This is where they made their second critical misjudgment. I printed a secondary copy. I edited section 11.2b to look identical, changing just a single word. Global became domestic. What they believed they were filing gave them unrestricted rights. What they actually signed only secured their control within U.S. boundaries. All international licensing rights remained untouchable. They were mine. I scanned the document, maintained the original file name and metadata, and simply changed a single character in the PDF's revision line. I sent it back with a brief, completed, appreciate the swiftness. Sarah, the assistant, replied in minutes. Thanks for the quick turnaround. You're a workhorse. Yes, I thought. A workhorse that just laid a minefield under your global revenue stream. After that, I began systematically recording every element. Audit trails, approval workflows, every compliance handshake service log. I duplicated the entire archival server onto a hidden cold drive. I saved every access path, administrator override, and even Slack history. Not out of paranoia, but preparation. I knew Robert. Once he thought he contained me, he would move to erase the rest. They assumed they were taking away my control. All I gave them was a rope to hang themselves. Her name was Maya Singh, a recent graduate from a prestigious university, maybe 27. Bright, quick with syntax, with an uncanny ability to map complex systems. Sharp, too sharp to be in that environment, too naive to understand the political landmine they'd place her on. I noticed her by the product wall one afternoon, a glass surface covered in erasable markers. She was drafting something I instantly recognized, my data bridge structure. Licensing logic on the left, regional overrides nested on the right, API handshakes tiered like a security system. It was my structure, block for block, lifted directly from my design. I simply watched. She never looked up. 2 days later, the corporate memo landed. Not for me, of course. I was no longer on distribution lists that mattered. I heard the gossip in the hallway. New lead transition for the core compliance framework. Effective immediately. Maya was the new face of what I had originated. And I was reassigned. One line in a Friday afternoon update. Elevated to senior technical strategist. The title sounded impressive, but it came with zero staff, no active projects, and no actual authority. Just an empty calendar. Then came the systematic decomposition. First, they revoked my core development access, citing a security refresh. Next, version control access, claiming I was now stakeholder adjacent. Then, the API logs, no visibility, no system keys. The lifeblood of the system was severed. Out of habit, I checked the admin console and found a new permissions note. Tier 3 view only. Applied retroactively. No write privileges. Retain legacy identity for archival purposes only. That was my new designation, a legacy artifact. Something to be archived and forgotten, not engaged with. They weren't just firing me. They were deleting my existence piece by piece, like a flawed subroutine they had suppressed before it triggered a system exception. But here's the final monumental truth they missed. While they were busy revoking tokens and closing access routes, I still possessed a master key. The root access I wrote into the failover system during a critical failure drill 8 years ago, a key Robert himself greenlit during a chaotic weekend when the staging environment collapsed. They never removed it because they had forgotten its existence entirely. Maya was drawing my house on their whiteboard, but I was the one who still held the only complete set of blueprints. It was 6:42 p.m. when I returned for the last time. The office was quiet. Most teams had cleared out after the quarter-end push. The low-motion sensor lights cast long, spectral shadows across empty desks. It already felt like a mausoleum. I still had my physical badge. Likely an oversight, or perhaps they expected me to simply toss it in the box. I didn't go to my old office. I went to sublevel 2, the floor with the auxiliary power terminal, the place reserved for emergency hardware maintenance. I walked in, breathing the cold air and the faint scent of ozone from the wire bundles. I pulled out the notebook. Black cover, spiral-bound, edges worn smooth. I started it a decade ago during the first system failover test. That book was my personal ledger. Every fallback script, every override sequence, every ghost route mapped as an absolute final resort. I flipped past the faded ink and yellowed receipts to the middle, where a single page was titled, Global license override. Final trigger. One conditional line of code. It was buried in logic that would never activate unless manually and directly invoked. I opened my laptop. The cold backup server was still operational, still authenticated to my ID. They hadn't touched it, hadn't wiped it, hadn't even looked. No one cares about the old bones beneath the new concrete. I ran a quick diagnostic. Everything clean. The logs were untouched. My ID still possessed root privileges. The clause they tried to erase was still alive, still binding. Override status. Active. Linked architect. Original. That was me. I didn't trigger it that night. I didn't need to. Just knowing that the core heart of the system still answered to me was enough. For now, they believed I was obsolete, but the system remembered its maker. It was 2:42 a.m. when I finally executed command. No theatrical music, no countdown, just me in my kitchen, illuminated by the soft blue light of the terminal. The command prompt blinked. I typed confirm. Pressing enter was the quietest earthquake I've ever experienced. The kill switch didn't cause an internal crash. It simply reached into the global network fabric and flipped the central licensing verification to inactive. Singapore was the first to lock up. Makes sense. Time zone proximity. Then Paris, then Frankfurt, then Prague. By 3:11 a.m., the entire European licensing network was bricked. Clients could no longer authenticate keys. Partners couldn't validate contracts. The compliance engines, the elegant routines I built to synchronize legal access across federated nodes, froze mid-execution. Everything ceased. My inbox began to pulse around 3:30 a.m. A quiet buzz at first, then a torrent. A message from an old Swedish vendor. License verification failure. Cannot push nightly patch. Ite, another from Dublin. Handshake error 0501 across all endpoints. System-wide issue. By 4 a.m., the flood included former high-level clients, CTOs, heads of global infrastructure, all asking the same question. Did you do this? I never replied. I didn't need to. Every boardroom on 3 continents was now asking a far more important question. Where's the man who built this? They thought they had buried me, replaced me with an untested shadow, and moved on. This wasn't sabotage. This was self-preservation of the code base. The system knew its rightful owner. They had dismissed the only person who knew how to prevent the collapse. And now they were finally bleeding. By day 4, Apex had lost over $500 million in contract renewals and pending deals. The first to go was the Belgian Health Authority, pulling their contract quietly with a 2-line public statement citing non-compliance and breach of licensing integrity. I knew the truth. Their systems couldn't renew keys, verify terms, or deploy essential updates. The dominoes began to fall. A major Finnish telecom, a massive French insurance syndicate, and a major Japanese bank whose compliance required Apex's engine to navigate multiple jurisdictions. Every international client was dead in the water. Licensing protocols failed silently. When the emergency routines kicked in, they found a global override, active, bound, and inaccessible. Robert attempted to soothe the press. The PR team stood in front of cameras with somber expressions, calling it a minor back-end disruption and blaming outdated legacy components and unanticipated schema volatility. The practice, defensive corporate language you use when your foundation is crumbling and investors are circling like hawks. The market didn't buy it. I monitored the investor forums and saw the leaks. A redacted legal memo appeared on a financial blog, mentioning an authentication entitlement gap tied to historical architectural ownership. That was me, in legal jargon. They were in a panic. I received the first call 48 hours in. It was from Graham Lyle, a venture capital partner, the same man who once told me, "You're an unparalleled technician, but leaders don't build. They delegate and move on." This time, his voice was hushed and slow. "Hey, just wondering if you consider a consulting role? Low profile, temporary, very high compensation." I told him I'd think about it. I never called back. The Apex core system didn't fail because I attacked it. It failed because they tried to rip out the foundation while standing on the roof. They called it trimming the fat. They cut the system's spine. And now They were choking on the total vacuum I had left behind. I didn't write a virus. I didn't commit a malicious act. All I did was stop safeguarding the system. And without me, it never learned to stand on its own. The final call arrived at 9:27 a.m. Block number, naturally. I was halfway through my coffee, watching a group of birds fly across the power lines, utterly peaceful. Then the screen lit up, and a small, patient part of me decided to answer. I put the phone to my ear. Silence. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in months. "Hello," said David, my former team lead, his voice tight and exhausted. "We require your signature." I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "It's just for a provisional reauthorization. Global license verification. It's a procedural stopgap until we can roll out a new solution." A stopgap? They torched the bridge and were now desperate for kindling. Still, I remained silent. David tried again. "We will provide massive compensation naturally. Name your price. Robert is open to equity, title consideration. We can put it in writing." Now I did laugh, a quiet, sharp, and bitter sound. "You deliberately deleted my name from the organizational chart." "It wasn't malice," he stammered. "It was strategic. You deleted the architect and then built a multi-billion-dollar company on the code that remained." I countered. Another pause. I could hear panicked, hushed voices in the background, one person saying, "Did anyone try the legacy rollback key?" David lowered his voice. "Listen, I know what happened was wrong, but the company is in free fall. Europe is dead. Japan is next. We just need this one action to regain control." Control. That was always their primary objective. Control the system, control the narrative, control the people who provided the value until they were deemed expendable. I stood up, walked a window, and looked out at the tranquil street. The world was still moving, even though Apex was frozen solid. "Let me save you the effort," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I already possess what truly matters." David didn't respond. I gave him a line I had rehearsed in my head every night since the day Robert slid those papers across the table without meeting my eyes. "You erased the architect," I concluded. "Now go and explain to your board why everything is silent." I ended the call. No regret. He finally sought my help and was met with absolute silence. And the man who once dismissed my capabilities was now standing on a collapsing foundation, begging me for a lifeline. Too late.